A very, very warm welcome to everybody today to this latest Caabu webinar. I realize a lot is going on at the moment, but delighted you can join us at Caabu today to look at the situation in Lebanon. We have a great panel for you to deal with a subject that I know is very much close to everyone's heart. We've all seen over the last year the protests that broke out in Lebanon, the extraordinary outpouring of anger and frustration at the failures of the political system in Lebanon, the outrage against the elites, the corruption, all of which, of course, was brought into even sharper focus after the 4th of August blast in Beirut, the apocalyptic scenes after what was one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in history. So today we will be reviewing all of this, but also trying to tease out how Lebanon can move forward, how it can get through this from what is clearly a very low point, and what role, I think particularly important for us as a British organization, the international community could and indeed should play, and perhaps also what it shouldn't do. So I'm really delighted to welcome our three speakers, Alia Moubayed, Ziad Abdel Samad and Ziad Majed. Just to give you a very brief introduction, but you've all had their biographies. Alia Moubayed is an experienced analyst with more than 25 years of experience in government, international financial institutions, financial markets and think tanks. She has worked, for example, at the International Institute for Strategic Studies here in London. And before that, she worked as the Chief Economist for the MENA region at Barclays. She's eminently qualified to discuss, particularly, I think she's going to address the issues of the economy for Lebanon, which of course is a major issue. We have also Ziad Majed. He's the Associate Professor and Program Coordinator for Middle East Pluralities at the American University of Paris. Ziad teaches Middle East Studies and writes on Lebanese, Syrian, Palestinian and Arab affairs, as well as regional politics. He's written a number of publications, one including, I noticed, Dans la tête de Bashar al-Assad, in the head of Bashar al-Assad. But that sounds a fairly interesting place to put yourself, if I may say so. But it's great to have him with us. And Ziad Abdel Samad, and Ziad is the Executive Director of the Arab NGO Network for Development. He's also based in Beirut. And the ANND, as it's called, brings together NGOs and national networks from 10 Arab countries and active in the protection of social and economic rights. He is president of the European Mediterranean NGO platform, a network gathering 83 national and regional networks and organizations. And you can read the rest of his bio. Very warm welcome, Ziad. But we're going to start off with Ziad Majed, who's there in Paris. And I think he's going to give us a general introduction and overview about the Lebanese political system right now and whether it can survive or not. Ziad, thank you very much for being with us today. A very warm welcome.
Thank you very much, Chris, for inviting. So thank you, Chris. A pleasure and an honor to be with you, with all the participants, and with my dear colleagues and friends, Alia and Ziad. In my presentation, as you just said, I will try to explain the Lebanese political system, how it was perceived, and why we believe it cannot function anymore, why even regardless of the terrible financial crisis and the many challenges that are today the current affairs of the country, why the system itself, the way it was put together under the French mandate and then through the first years of the independence, is becoming incapable of dealing with crisis, of dealing with the evolution of the Lebanese society, and with the implications of the regional crisis in Lebanon. So first, when it comes to this political system, some people do call it sectarian, do call it confessional. Well, it is in political science called consociational, and it's not unique to Lebanon. It is, in a way, the one that the Swiss Confederation adopted. Belgium has a system that is a bit similar. And this system was put together in 1926 in the constitution during the French mandate. The idea is behind it is that in vertically divided societies where primordial affiliations, where linguistics or ethnic or sectarian religious identities might be stronger than other kind of divisions, class divisions, ideological divisions, left wing, right wing, etc., there is a need to have a system that would reflect through a power sharing formula and through a certain quota what the society is really about. Now, part of it is in a way a true reflection of how the Lebanese society was and what kind of configuration the French found in Lebanon, because there was also an Ottoman long history of religious autonomy in Mount Lebanon, of communities managing their own affairs. So there was something about it that was real in the Lebanese society, but there is also something related to the French Orientalist and colonial school. Britain had something similar as well in Iraq and in other places that saw the Lebanese first as Muslims and Christians or as Druze and other groups. And the idea of the system thus is to distribute the most important political positions on the representatives of the different communities through the electoral system that would respect a certain quota, through the fact that the president of the republic could be from a certain community, the prime minister from another one, the speaker of the parliament from a third one. And then with the independence of the country in 1943, I don't know what, if someone is not mute maybe, or I'm the one who's, there is a, you can hear me clearly?
We can hear you, yes.
Okay, because sometimes I do have echoes. So in 1943, with the independence of the country and with what was called the National Pact between the Lebanese, those who were in a way not convinced at the beginning of the necessity of an independence, who thought that remaining under a French mandate is not that terrible idea. And on the other, some who thought in Lebanon a kind of a plot against Arab unity, against a larger Syria, or against an Arab nation. The compromise that was found in 1943 between the representatives of different communities was to accept the independence of the country, and then on the one hand to neglect the special connection to France, and on the other to abandon the Arab nationalist dream or the construction of a larger Syria, and to accept this compromise that is Lebanon. So from the beginning, there was something like a malaise in the constituency and in the concept of Lebanon itself, and that we will find it later in different crises. And during that national pact, following the independence, it was agreed that the president of the republic would become Christian Maronite, the prime minister Muslim Sunni, the speaker of the parliament Muslim Shia, and then the parliament and the government would be divided between the representatives of the Christians and the Muslims with a formula that was 6 Christians for 5 Muslims. So this original philosophy aimed at having a power sharing structure between mainly Muslims and Christians. However, with time, with the demographic evolution of the country, we were not anymore into this original configuration, Christians and Muslims. We were much more now in between Christians, but also Shia Muslims and Sunni Muslims. And this made it much more difficult to always have understandings and to always have majorities without excluding one of the 3 groups, or without allowing that group of feeling alienated and marginalized from the political system or the political structure and its decision making. Plus, this system itself was designed for political elites that were much more like notable elites, landowners, they were lawyers, merchants. The mentality of the political elites was much more different than it is today, was about compromises, was about mercantilist system, was about trying to preserve a certain neutrality in the region without getting too much involved in the Arab-Israeli conflict, but also avoiding the clashes that the Arab Cold War and the Cold War in general could have in terms of implications in Lebanon. We saw that in the mini civil war in 1958, after which immediately the Lebanese agreed on avoiding Nasserism and the Pact of Baghdad that anyway collapsed at the same time. So we did have a certain agreement between the notables to avoid confrontations. But with the civil war of Lebanon and with the militant elites during that civil war, plus with the Palestinian factor and the fact that the presence of the Palestinians did politicize more and more young people in the leftist groups in general and brought them into a request to change the system and to abolish this consociational or confessional philosophy of it on the one hand, and on the other, the right-wing Christian conservatives groups who wanted to preserve the system as it is without accepting some reforms that Muslim elites were calling for about participation, about the prerogatives of the president of the republic who was dominant in the political scene. So all of this led to the war, and through the war, you had very militant elite with different characteristics. They are not anymore related to the old notables or related to the merchants and the lawyers of the city. They were into either changing the system or unifying the community and looking for regional alliances that would consolidate their positions. Plus, of course, when you have a region with lots of conflicts, then regional actors will look for internal allies. And the whole setting of the Lebanese politics started to change, leading after the war to the same elites that led the war to become the new governors of the country, with few exceptions. The main exception is the left that was marginalized and was defeated by the Syrian regime's intervention in 1976, and then by the Israeli invasions in 78 and 1982. Meanwhile, a very strong actor emerged on the Lebanese scene following the Iranian Revolution of 1979. I'm talking, of course, about Hezbollah. And within each Lebanese large community, there was an attempt by the military actor who became later the political leaders of the post-war country to unify their community so that they impose the community's conditions within any kind of negotiation, any kind of formation of a government, of elections, electoral list. So we had among the Christians one or two groups monopolizing the political scene. We have on the Shia side the same question, on the Druze side the same question, and then among the Sunni, the Hariri phenomenon, the multi-billionaire who came from Saudi Arabia to start the reconstruction within a framework of understanding that followed the Gulf War between the US, Saudi Arabia, and Syria, to have a kind of an umbrella allowing for Hariri to reconstruct, but keeping the political decision in the country to the Syrian regime and mainly its Shia allies. You know the development after that, and then the assassination of Hariri and the uprising against the Syrian regime, and the new division in Lebanon that followed the division of the civil war, this time about the Syrian question and about Hezbollah and its weapons, that will paralyze the Lebanese political life from 2005 until very recently, until the mid-2015-16, when one new development started. So throughout those years, the system was very rigid. The only thing that changed is the quota of representation of the Muslim communities, some modifications to the prerogatives of the President of the Republic that left some Christians frustrated about it, but with completely different characteristics of the political elite, with a monopolization of the representation of each community, and with very strong alliances between Hezbollah and Iran, between Hariri, father and then son, after the assassination of the father, and Saudi Arabia, with a conflict also taking place between the United States and Iran and having its repercussions in Lebanon, with the Israeli factor in the region and its threat, and then Hezbollah refusing to disarm. So all of that made the situation extremely difficult to manage. And the fact that the system cannot be easily modified, the fact that there is a kind of a veto right whenever an important decision should be taken, the fact that the electoral system would always renew to the political class. I mean, it will renew the same political class because the voting age is 21 in Lebanon and is not 18. because the districts will be always set in a way that would help the former warlords and the political leaders to keep winning the seats, and because the formation of the government will always follow the same logic of having the representatives who are the same of the large communities choosing their own ministers, and then the ministers will choose people in the administration, and then the administration will always work on enlarging the clientelistic network of the party that it represents or of the community. So the quotas will be everywhere and will encourage, in that sense, inefficiency and corruption. And whenever you have a corruption scandal here, another one will appear there, and then they neutralize each other, not to avoid some judicial or some political procedures that would show one community accused or the other accusing it. So this whole culture of sectarianism and this whole culture of the consociational democracy that was put together before the independence cannot function anymore. And I give you just two examples. We haven't had any presidential election that follow the exact calendar and the constitution as it is since 1982. In 1982, under the Israeli occupation, we had a president elected while a part of the parliament was opposed to the elections. He was assassinated. Then there was a kind of a compromise to bring his brother to replace him. In 1988, with the end of the mandate of that brother, who was the president, there was no elections. And guess who was the candidate at the time? Michel Aoun in 1988, the same who is now the president. After a long period of a vacuum, a president was chosen in 89. He will be assassinated. And then another one was chosen in exceptional conditions. And following the end of his mandate, the Syrian regime renewed his mandate, violating the constitution. And then after the end of that, the chief of the army was elected president, while constitutionally he doesn't have the right to run for elections. So once again, the constitution was modified to allow him to run. After the end of his mandate, the Syrian regime once again extended the mandate for 3 more years. And then there was, for 2 years, an absence when it comes to a new president because of the incapacity of the political elite to find a compromise and to choose a president, since the vote is in the parliament. And before Michel Aoun was elected in 2016, we also had another 2 years of vacuum since there was no possibility to elect president. Exactly the same, and this is my second example, is the case when governments are formed. Each time a government is to be formed, there is months and months of people waiting for the compromises and the agreements, and who will choose whom, and what will be the role of Iran, what will be the role of Saudi Arabia, what will the American say at the end. This is, of course, after the end of the Syrian hegemony. So all of that makes the political system today incapable of digesting crisis, of dealing with them, of renewing the political life, and even of reforming itself, because the mentality of those who lead the state is opposed to any reform and to any change, because regional actors with their allies do paralyze the political life, because there is a Lebanese party that is still not only powerful and legitimate in terms of its popularity, but it also has weapon, and it has an organic relation with an external actor. And of course, I'm talking about Hezbollah and Iran, that is not only defending Lebanon against Israel, which many Lebanese could approve and support, it is also contributing to conflicts in the region and sending fighters to defend the Syrian regime and sending consultants to Iraq, and thus opening Lebanon as a theater to many of the terrible events of the region. And in this kind of configuration, it is extremely difficult to modify an electoral law, to modify the concept of the power sharing formula, and to talk about a citizenship that is capable through its creativity, through its activism, the one that we saw, and I think my colleagues will talk about, to reconstruct a new Lebanon or a new political system. And if you combine with that the whole financial management and all the economic crisis and currently the terrible situation, you have a country that is just pushing some of its people to leave, to look for another place and for another sky. And that's terrible. But hopefully there are still some signs of, I don't want to say optimism, but some potential, let's say, to modify this whole situation. So I'll stop for now, and I hope that we can exchange more in the questions answer session.
Brilliant. Ziad, thank you very much for a masterful overview of the Lebanese political situation and how we've got there. I think that really sets us up for the next two speakers. Just to remind everybody before I go on to ask Alia to talk to us, that if you want to pose any questions to our panelists today, if you could put them down in the chat, that would be great. And we shall get through as many as possible. Obviously, it'd be better if they're nice, brief and clear. That would be very helpful. Now, it's my great pleasure to welcome Alia Moubayed to talk to us, particularly, I think, about the economic situation and challenges that Lebanon faces. Indeed, one wonders whether they're greater or not than the political challenges. Alia.
Absolutely, Chris, and thank you very much for Caabu for inviting me and joining dear friends Ziad and Ziad. I will start. I will try in my in the time allotted to me to really sort of focus on three issues. The first one, try to explain what is happening with the financial meltdown. Second, maybe since we are here to reflect on is there a way out, and that's the objective of this webinar, to outline some perspective for the exit from the existing crisis, and then reflect on the outlook from there, given what we've just heard from Ziad and what I think I know Ziad will talk about in terms of the most recent, basically, dynamics of the protest movement. So in terms of the economic crisis, I mean, certainly this is not the first economic crisis that Lebanon goes through. The only major difference is that it's by no means the most existential that the country is going through for the last 30 or even more, for 30 years or even more. Lebanon has faced currency crisis in the 80s. It has been living with debt for the last 30 years since the post-war reconstruction boom and financing started, and has always basically managed to muddle through these multiple economic and financial crises. Only this time, the existential nature of its crisis stems from the fact that it's a multi-pronged type of financial crisis. And also the scale of it as a size of its GDP is much bigger, and I'll explain. It's a multi-pronged in the sense that it is at the same time a balance of payment crisis. So there has been a sudden stop of capital in Lebanon starting at the second half of 2019, as capital flows dried up. And this is a country with very large current account deficit, more than 14 to 15 billion dollars of external financing needs per year. And this sudden stop of capital was one aspect of the crisis. The second aspect is obviously that it is also a debt and a debt crisis. Lebanon's debt has been above 140% for more than decades, and most recently it has just continued to edge up, mainly because of a slower growth, particularly with the growth slowdown that Lebanon witnessed as the Syria crisis started. And we got to a point where this debt became increasingly unsustainable, leading to basically a debt default as the sudden stop of capital happened, because much of our ability to service our debt was also linked to these fresh inflows of capital that have stopped. And the third is really, and this is where it is different from past crises, is the fact that we've gone into also a banking crisis. And the reason why is basically because our banking system, which for a long time has been known for its resilience to shock, its strong capitalization and liquidity, found itself over the last, particularly over the last 10 years, being the subject of intermediating capital to basically fund a non-sustainable public sector size and debt, but also an unsustainable choice of exchange rate policy, i.e. a fixed exchange rate that it funded through the banking system. And the reason for the crisis is that all this banking system was attracting the capital of from abroad and mainly non-resident deposit, most of which is the money of the Lebanese diaspora, but not only, but also regional money, and offering exorbitant returns, quite attractive, but for a risk of not being paid, as we saw as the crisis imploded, to the extent where more than 75% of the assets of banks were actually exposed to the sovereign and the central bank risk. And this is the difference of Lebanon's crisis with other financial crises that we find in emerging markets, is that it is not, the debt is not only at the level of the state, but it's also at the level of a large, basically, net negative reserve position of the central bank, and which is basically all the money and the deposits in dollars, which amounted to more than $120 billion at the implosion of the crisis, that the central bank, obviously not being able to print dollars, cannot give back. So these three aspects of the crisis, as they imploded, led to the churning out or the multiplication of various results or negative consequences, a very strong contraction in economic activity, and now we are witnessing, the economy is witnessing almost 25% contraction in real terms. So seeing basically per capita income being more than halved in less than a year. We're witnessing a currency crisis as a result of the banking and the balance payment crisis. More than 80% of the value of the currency have been lost, with a development of a multiple exchange rate and parallel exchange rate. And this obviously led to hyperinflation, I mean double-digit inflation, but now hyperinflation, most recently more than 120% inflation, that is really wiping out the savings of the Lebanese, but also undermining much of the livelihoods, particularly of the poor and middle class, throwing hundreds of thousands into unemployment. So we saw the unemployment now exceeding 35% informal estimates, and poverty rates, according to World Bank, exceeding 50%. The last number was in March, 50% of the population below the poverty line, compared to 37% in 2019, and probably now more than that. But this also is a result, obviously, of two major developments, is the COVID crisis that hit the economy amidst this financial meltdown, with the mismanagement of the COVID that we are seeing, but also the unfortunate and horrible explosion that happened at the core, basically at the heart of a critical infrastructure, which is the Beirut port, and which deepened the contraction of the GDP and was a major hit to hundreds of thousands of people and to businesses. So the economy is really reeling under these huge shocks. But I think most important, what worsened all this and added to this multiplicity of these shocks is really the policy inaction, and that speaks to what Ziad was talking about, which is a result both of this dysfunctional political system, but at the same time of the multiple, basically, struggle of power as the crisis is hitting basically the key privileges that the ruling elites and the spoils that they have been extracting out of the state and that led to the deterioration of its finances and the large losses at the central bank, insisting on keeping the exchange rate pegged, really found themselves struggling to curtail their losses by trying to avoid an overhaul of the system, which you would see in any country facing such an existential crisis. So unlike, for example, Greece or Cyprus or others, where fundamental structural reforms and a roadmap dealing with the debt crisis, the banking crisis, were drawn with support of the international community, we are finding ourselves both a combination of a lack of willingness, a lack of competence, and lacks of ability to move the country and its economy on a virtuous path, as painful as it is, of orderly exit, being thwarted by its political elite. And the main reason why is because really the size of the losses in the system, which exceed 60 to 70 billion of dollars, somebody has to bear the brunt of these losses, and these losses need to be distributed. And that means basically those who've benefited from the system for a long time, from large depositors with a huge concentration of deposit in the banking system, or some of the political elites who sit at or who have strong links within the banking system, or who benefited from connected lending from the banking system, are now trying to avoid this overhaul, which would imply basically that they would bear the brunt. And instead, by choosing to enact, they are doing what we call a socialization of the losses, i.e., imposing the losses through hyperinflation and exchange rate devaluation, and leaving the state of the banks as they are and turning them into zombie banks. Now, do we know how to get out of the crisis? Of course, we know, and I think many of us, among those who are speaking today, but also many maybe who are attending among us, have contributed a lot of ideas, have drawn roadmaps, have suggested a way forward for the authorities. And basically, I think the choice is clear. I think there are no quick fixes. This is going to be a protracted, long road towards an exit and a recovery. But obviously, there are clearly immediate actions that need to be taken. These immediate actions necessitate a passing of a capital control law, which, despite the fact that more than $10 billion have flown out of the system because of this inaction I talked about, could still be reduced through a proper, comprehensive, transparent, enforceable capital control law that would reduce the leakages out of the system. That is necessary to stop the bleeding. Another immediate action will be really a rationalization of a costly and untargeted subsidy system that is not benefiting those who need it. The reduction of the multiple exchange rate. There are important immediate action to stop the bleeding, which we know about, but yet for a whole year or more than 6 months recently, despite the pressure from the international community, from the businesses, from this movement, the authorities have not been able to take that because of the blockage by the political system. But in addition to this, to these measures that could help stopping the bleeding, of course, we need to approach the crisis with in a comprehensive way. And when I say comprehensive way, meaning really sort of have a solid debt restructuring and fiscal reform program that would address the unsustainability of public finances, but also addresses the composition of spending, making it more towards social and mitigating the impact of the crisis and on the poor, and improving the efficiency of the spending, but also on the revenue side, improving the social equity of our tax system. The second pillar of this comprehensive approach would be the restructuring of the banking system in parallel with the fiscal reform plan, in a way to put back the financial sector in its right size, because it's clearly an oversized banking system that the society and the economy cannot sustain. But also restore confidence in it through a rule-based approach to and a stronger regulation of the sector, which its demise has unraveled the weaknesses of its regulatory framework. And third, an important pillar, which would be the whole social safety net and strong, basically, social protection system that Lebanon has been lacking for a long time, which I'm sure Ziad will talk about. But I think more importantly, and I would even put it as a forefront and front-loaded if we were to talk about prioritization, is really the whole structural governance-related reform, because I think, and this is where I will start ending my intervention. I don't think the Lebanese society and citizens will be willing to undertake and undergo more pain, and these are painful structural adjustment reforms that are necessary, whether with an IMF program or without, if we don't re-establish a system of good governance based on an independent judiciary, on strong accountability, on a transparent and efficient procurement and public investment and public financial management system, a solid and contestable competition framework, etc., etc. So we really also have this important governance reform pillar that should be at the core. Now, will we go that way? I think what will determine whether we will go in that direction of this virtuous cycle or not is obviously what will happen within the political configuration in the coming few months, but I think also in the way the international community will engage with whoever will lead the next phase if we have a new government in the next few weeks. I think it is very clear that implementing these structural reforms that would lead into the transformation of the economic model and that is clearly unsustainable as much as its political system is no more a functional one, will require a strong legitimacy, a credibility that so far those in charge of the politics of the country lack. And as an economist, we have seen across emerging markets that unless you have this political legitimacy and credibility and a diffusion of conflict of interest that has beset public affairs in Lebanon for a long time, I think it would be extremely difficult to move ahead. And I think that would be the strong, important point that the international community and both official international partners, but also external NGOs, intellectuals, media in the external in the international community would really need to focus on in order to make sure that Lebanon does not end up more into the failed state model and does not drift into this subsistence level of small peanut dollars of international aid while it is seeing its human capital emigrate and its financial capital destroyed. Thank you very much.
Alia, thank you very much. That was an excellent insight into the economic system, and indeed, as you mentioned, a very powerful point at the end about the linkage between the need of political reform as well. It's please keep on with the questions. Some of them are coming in through the chat. Thank you very much for those. But it's my great pleasure to welcome Ziad Abdel Samad now, who's going to take us forward and have a look at I think some of the issues surrounding the protest movements and social cohesion in Lebanon. Ziad, a very warm welcome to you.
Yes, thank you very much. First, thank you for hosting this excellent panel, and I'm very honored to be part of it. First, let me say that Beirut Blast of August 4 is the manifestation of the major governance failure of the state institutions. Both corruption and negligence disabled the main agencies from doing their job properly. Even the reaction and the response of the state agencies indicated the extent to what the public institutions were paralyzed and dysfunctional. There was no coordination, weak responsiveness, lack of vision. So thanks to the local and international civil society and global agencies and the coordination led by the UN agencies, people managed to get the minimum required needs and recovery. It's worth mentioning that the Bar Association with other syndicates managed also to play a coordination role mainly in assessing the damages, removing rubbers in a professional way, and rehabilitation few houses. This highlights the importance of the role of civil society institutions and groups in times of crisis, mainly with the absence of the state institutions or public sector. Despite the sad reality, the ruling elite keeps on doing business as usual, which is very clear in the negotiations held nowadays to form the government. First, with the appointment of the Prime Minister Mustafa Adib, who failed to form an independent government as per the requirements of the initial French initiatives, and the demand of the Lebanese people, because the national unity government has low popularity. And this is, by the way, the important result of the appraising, where people don't appreciate anymore power sharing system or the existing power sharing system that Ziad mentioned in his presentation. And now, by appointing Saad al-Hariri, who is one of the main responsible of the failure, only to remind us that Mr. Hariri was the prime minister in October 17. His government imposed the taxation law and is responsible of the looming economic collapse that prompted the appraising. Mr. Hariri resigned after the rejection of the reform plan he suggested in October 21st by the public involved in the appraising. The pressure that the political elite is doing now to form the government of national unity, where they insist to be represented, and the way they conduct negotiations around the distribution of the portfolios among them, shows the way of thinking and the intention to protect their proper interest and the interest of their cronies and clients by protecting the same power sharing formula or insisting on applying the same power sharing formula. The government of national unity, which means consociational government, is the demand of the international community, assuming that this will help in adopting the reform agenda and implement it, because they are in the parliament and they can vote for the suggested reforms or reject other suggested reforms. Although this political elite is the main responsible of the failure because of their corruption, they even lost the legitimacy in October 17, but they still have the legal status, unfortunately. They are not representing the political will and aspirations of the Lebanese people, but they still have the legal status. The people gained the legitimacy since October 17, but not the legality. And this is the main reason behind the political stagnation that we are witnessing nowadays. It's a deadlock where people that they have legitimacy but not the legal status, while the political elite, they don't have any legitimacy but they have the legal status. They are literally occupying the state, committing grave violations of the constitution, of the constitutional law even, and many other laws. For example, Amal and Hezbollah insist to keep the Ministry of Finance with them. And the same two parties insist to nominate all the Shia ministers in the government, which is something completely anti-constitutional. October 17 was a turning point in Lebanon, which explains the aggressive reaction of the alliance between the mafia and the militia, the corrupted system and the militias. They severely suppressed popular uprising using different tools, including direct assault, shrinking space for freedoms, basically freedom of assembly, freedom of expression, and many other aggressive practices. The key demands of October 17 uprising went far beyond the resignation of the government. It was asking for a deep political and systemic changes towards the civil state. In other words, to end sectarianism and the power-sharing formula among the community representatives, and to create a secular system starting from adopting a new electoral law and the civic code, besides many other reforms. The priority was given by the uprising to nominate an independent government. The main demand was an independent government of transition with some legislative authorities to be able to realize the agenda. And in our Lebanese history after the independence, we had nominated several government with legislative power and authorities. Unfortunately, the fast deterioration of the social and economic conditions, the scale of the pandemic spread, in addition to the severe suppression in different forms, slowed down the uprising, not to forget the geopolitical and regional contexts where Lebanon is in the middle between an occupied occupation from one side and a civil war from the other side. Moreover, the region witnesses a complicated geopolitical struggle among global and regional actors with a high influence inside Lebanon, as Ziad Majed already mentioned. However, the popular movement nowadays rejects any form of national unity government and is back to the initial demands to form an independent government of transition with some legislative authorities, as mentioned, to fulfill at least two main tasks. As priority, the first task is to adopt a new electoral law and to conduct free and democratic elections organized by an independent commission with an international observation. The law should be based on the constitution. I mean, adopt a secular electoral law for the parliament and create a second chamber, the Senate, to represent the different legally recognized sects in Lebanon. The Senate aims at assuring the different sects that their rights and interests will remain protected. The second task will be to adopt the administrative decentralization law securing the equal and just development and prosperity among the regions, something very needed in a highly centralized system, and to adopt an urgent reform agenda and implement a social protection system to assist and protect people from the mounting needs and threats due to the humanitarian, economic, social, monetary crisis. The aim will be to address the high percentage of poverty, which is more than 60%, unemployment, which exceeds 30%, inflation rate that became more than 115%, besides the health condition and obstacles to education in times of the pandemic, as well as the food security threatened by the inability to import goods with the lack of foreign currency, as mentioned by Alia. It's worth noting that these reforms don't require any constitutional amendment. At the contrary, these are the requirements of the Constitution since 1990, and they were never implemented. It was the same elite who prevented their implementation. To be able to achieve these two big important objectives, a number of political groups, some of them existed even before the uprising, others are newly established after the October 17, are trying to put in place different forms of coalitions and fronts in coordination with the professional syndicates such as the Bar Association, the engineers, the medical doctors, the pharmacists, and the main academic non-profit establishments and universities, along with trade unions and labor unions and others. The intention is to create a big coalition, and this is something that is a process ongoing, and to take the lead to exert more pressure and defy the current system, to recover the state and probably the stolen assets, also to liberate the public institutions from clientelism and nepotism. These groups are working to elaborate alternative policies, namely at the economic and social dimensions. How to move towards a productive, redistributive economic system, but also conducting national debates around the political reform needed to phase out from the crisis. It's worth noting here that we need to rethink the whole economic and social approach, where the social dimension should not be perceived anymore as a byproduct of the economic growth. Social policies are not about safety nets, but they should be kind of a comprehensive social protection system with universal coverage and covering different sectors and regions in a country where you have more than 60% and the number is growing of poor, unemployment, whatsoever. The international community and the solidarity movements and groups have a role to play, mainly by supporting this emerging stream. It's worthy to say that the collapse of Lebanon will create serious threats to the region and the Mediterranean. Lebanon is hosting more than 1 million Syrian refugees, around 500,000 officially registered Palestinian refugees, maybe only 180 or 200,000 maximum Palestinians remain living in Lebanon, in different parts of Lebanon, but the others, they don't lose their right as refugees registered in Lebanon, even if they are living abroad. So it's important to always take into consideration and to underline that any external pressure and sanctions can help, but will not have the expected results unless they rely on a strong global movement able to break the status quo and lead the nation towards real changes. And this is why we are planning to create in the coming future such a coalition or a movement. So thank you for being with us and thank you for your attention. I stop here.
Ziad, thank you very much for that. And I think that those of us who know Lebanon appreciate the tremendous work that so many civil society organizations have done and are doing to build this sort of coalition in the face of, the existing power structures. It's tremendously important, and you certainly have our solidarity. I'm going to open it up now to questions, and I wonder if I could, first of all, we have a question from Wayne David. Wayne, are you there?
Yes, I am. And I think the answer in part to my question was just touched upon a moment ago, because we've had an analysis of the political system, how it came about, and its profound weaknesses. But the question is how do you change that? Because, as we've heard, there's an inbuilt move to maintain the status quo at all costs, almost. So it's how do you break that logjam and liberate the country and unleash the good intentions of a majority of the people? And I was wondering if Ziad would like to expand a little bit upon how this coalition might be created.
Ziad, do you want to come back on that? Ziad Abdel Samad.
Yes, I mean, it's true that there is a tremendous effort, and I mean, the system or the status quo of this power sharing formula is being protected by a strong, let's say, alliance between the mafia and the militia. And I was very clear in mentioning this. But the positive, issue is that the system is in a total collapse and is in crisis. And I really doubt that they have the ability to phase out easily from the crisis. I'm not talking only about the economic and financial crisis, but I'm also talking about the political crisis where, as I mentioned, they lost legitimacy. Let me say that during the last period, few months ago, the representative of this political elite were ashamed publicly by the Lebanese public. Many of them that are not able to go out to the streets to sit in a cafe or in a restaurant, they have a protection. So the mounting, let's say, anger and from the population is incredibly increasing. And at the same time, they are in crisis. And the result of this crisis, we can see that it has been few months, they are not able to agree on a formula to nominate a government. And a government is a priority for them in order to be able to build their trust with the international community. So they are not able to establish any kind of trust with the international community. And this is a reflection of the crisis. So they are in crisis, which means that this popular movement coming all together and creating. And the positive issue also is that when I mentioned the professional syndicates, I'm talking about I'm not talking about the trade unions and labor unions. We are talking about professional. This is part of including the chambers, the private sector, because the private sector is also victimized by this crisis. So this will create a serious pressure on the political system. We don't have the power to make a coup, but I think that we have the power to start introducing serious reforms without tackling even any constitutional amendment. So by introducing laws, electoral law, decentralization, civic code, etc. So these are reforms that they can, let's say, we can build on in order to start moving on towards more effective changes. It's not for tomorrow, it's a process.
Thank you, Ziad. And certainly I'll ask our other two speakers to consider if they have anything to add to that as we go through the other questions, if I may. I was going to just call Rebecca from Amnesty has a question, which perhaps for Ziad Majed. Rebecca, you there? Not sure she's still online, but I'll read out our question because it's very much, I think, for you, Ziad. What role can the international community play to pressure the Lebanese authorities to implement real reforms and changes? And perhaps as you answer that, you could also perhaps reflect on the role of President Macron, who seemed to want to occupy a central role in all of this.
Yes, okay. I will try to address also two other questions by Zakia and by Ali Jimenez, I think, who mentioned similar issues, and to build up on what Ziad Abdel was saying. In fact, there are two approaches today to deal with the political situation. One is very radical, that is to abolish this consociational confessional system that is incapable today of managing the country, of moving away from the crisis. And we have been through a series of crises in the last years, and each time there were either foreign mediation or new compromises, but finally the country collapsed. So there is a radical approach. We finish and we do build something else that is based on a new political contract without confessional representation, a kind of a secular system that would require as well a new political philosophy and a new economic philosophy for it to survive in its region. Unfortunately, the balance of power today would not allow such an approach to develop. So the other approach that is not a compromise, but is more like an approach of reforms of changes here and there in the institutions, maybe in the constitution, in the electoral system. And Ziad Abdel Samad mentioned a few questions that could be extremely important. One of them is the creation of a Senate and the liberation of the political representation in the parliament from confessional and sectarian connotations. The other could be the decentralization, and decentralization in Lebanon is not only about the sustainable development and the fair development in the regions in comparison to Lebanon, to Beirut and the center, but it is also about the fact that local governance in Lebanon, municipalities, already are not elected and chosen based on confessional representation. And that would create some laboratories for citizens to develop their political skills in order to become powerful political actors. The electoral system, we have an electoral system that keep excluding a large part of the voters from any representation. So we need also to modify it. We need to have the age for voting set at 18 and not anymore 21. There are lots of reforms. What we fear today is, and here I will deal with the international community and with Macron, is that the current political elite, Hariri, who is back, with Hezbollah and Amal, with the Lebanese forces, and of course with Aoun, with other groups, with Jumblat and the rest of the political club, they can accept some cosmetic reforms, especially when it comes to the economy and some aspects of the financial conditions, and Alia know more about that, in order to get some of the promised money so that they can manage it and gain some time, and then once again continue in their business as usual to avoid serious reforms and probably to allow for some elections later and much later, relying on what still exists as popular legitimacy around Hezbollah, in order to once again win the election with the electoral law that is favorable to them, to create a new political reality in which they might allow for small room for some opponents to be with them and to say, well, this is the new situation in Lebanon and we have to move forward. So the international community, its responsibility is, on the one hand, to keep pressuring the Lebanese political elite today, not to give up the conditions when it comes to the foreign aid, even if aid is really needed and by lots of people, by a majority of people in the country, but without political reforms and without administrative reforms and without allowing for a clear monitoring of how the expenses will be decided and who will do what and who will construct what and what kind of distribution of the loss when it comes to the banks will happen, the current political elite once again would be capable of making all kind of arrangements and to benefit financially through its networks and through the clientelist huge machine that it established in the country and it built in the country throughout the years to deal with the foreign support and assistance and to survive and to once again gain time in order to renew itself. Macron, in his first visit, did say clear things about the necessity of reform, about the fact that he does not trust the political elite in the country today, that the assistance should go directly to some institutions or could even be managed by an international body that could be independent, credible, etc. However, in his second visit, he returned a little bit to political realism and to the fact that we need what he called a government of mission, while the majority of the groups in the street and those who were in the uprising were using a term that is very clear, a political transition. So a government of transition that will move from a situation to another. When we say a government of mission and a kind of a large coalition that will bring again most of the tenors, most of the heavyweight of the political class, it would mean that we will remain within the same configuration and they might hijack the whole process of reforms. So that was his maybe mistake. And anyway, he was not capable of imposing the conditions that he evoked in the first visit, and they gained time. Probably in Lebanon, there are much more consideration, and they take much more seriously what will happen between the United States and Iran. So they are waiting for the US elections to happen. They will see whether the US approach towards Iran will change. And this is mainly Hezbollah's approach. We keep a kind of a statu quo in Lebanon. If we can get some foreign aid in order to spend some money and to, let's say, contain the frustration and the anger and deal with some extreme urgent issues, it's much better. And then we see how internationally we can position ourselves again. Maybe Iran would be in a better shape in the future. So we will impose our will as we used to do before. And Macron tried to be in that kind of dead moment of international approaches and initiatives between the US and Iran, hoping that the Iranians would approve his initiative because they need connections with the West. And France is among the very rare Western actors who did not consider Hezbollah as a terrorist organization. So that gave him a margin to deal with all Lebanese actors. Plus, he thought also that on the US side, whether Trump or Biden will make it, especially if Biden makes it, there will be much more coordination between Washington, Paris, or other European actors than today, and that will allow his initiative to develop. But one can also say that beyond Lebanon, France does have priorities in the Middle East today. Beirut could allow France a strategic position on the eastern Mediterranean coast, where today Russia has a very important bases in Latakia and Tartus in Syria, where Turkey is one of the strongest actors, where a kind of a conflict is bringing Turkey in front of Greece, supported by the European Union and France specifically. Plus in Israel, there is a huge development when it comes to the port of Haifa, in which Chinese companies are involved. So there is a need for France to have the port of Beirut as well as kind of an entry or a gate or a bridge to a wider Middle Eastern French policy that could even go reach Iraq, where the American-Iranian dynamic is a bit similar to the Lebanese one. So without an international serious pressure and conditioned aid approach, this political class that has always been capable of surviving and that is really resilient, even more than the system that is obsolete today, is resilient, is still relying on Hezbollah and on its capacity to crack down on people in the street and its capacity to mobilize a large part of the Shiite community for different reasons. This political class would not accept any serious reform. It's only through defeating it, either with a serious modification of the balance of power or through a series of reforms that will each time will seize part of what it has today, what it has confiscated for years, that change would be possible. Otherwise, the situation will continue to deteriorate, and there will be very few possibilities to see things differently.
Well, thank you very much. That was a very clear exposition. And I think you mentioned the US administration. It looks like that will be a Biden administration. So we shall see what that brings. I'm going to take one final question for Alia from Bassem Sneji. I don't know if I pronounced your name right, Bassem. Are you there?
Indeed, I'm here.
If you'd like to ask your question.
No, just mentioning one of the remarks that Alia made regarding the lack of competencies as part of the blockage and the current mayhem in the country. And well, Lebanon is known to have an overflow of competencies rather than a lack of it. And my suggestion was to actually propose the fact that many of those competencies are actually very efficient and used to maintain the consensus rather than being used in a proper way. And most of the competencies available are not always used for the better. Mostly regarding Mr. Salami himself, who was named as a central banker, best central banker a few years ago. He is a very competent central banker. It doesn't take anything from his competent credit. It is how you use and to what service do you put these competencies at work.
Great. Thank you very much for that, Alia.
Yeah, no, thank you, Bassem. I think this is certainly a very well put remark, and I can sort of answer it in both yes and no, particularly if I look historically at how the level of competences and their use towards basically policy formulation have gone throughout. I was talking more about the period that where policy, where within the administration you have competent people who could strike a balance between the competence for serve the politician and competence to serve the national interest. And I think for a period in the post-war era, there was a very few years where some administration, but even naturally, the need to bring in some technocratic knowledge, particularly into the economic ministries, have brought a lot of people who had a good understanding and built economic institutions after the war. Now, some of them obviously employed their knowledge towards a given political choices, but others were inside the administration were able to do this counterbalance. But I think in the last 10 years, the civil service was either strongly basically avoided by intentionally by people who saw that their ability to influence the system from within and to counterbalance basically the very narrow and clientelist political agenda in policy formulation was almost impossible, and they could not influence it, and then they chose to leave or to the country or to go to the private sector. And also the system was able to take over the recruitment of new entrants into the public administration and make it increasingly less meritocratic and more clientelist, and tip the balance towards the use of technical knowledge to serve the politicians and this same political class that we've talked about, as opposed to serve the public interest. I'm not saying that the administration is void of well-intentioned, credible, and well-serving and people dedicated to the public interest, but those unfortunately have become a minority. And this brings me to the importance of, as we talk about what could the international community do, to go back to Rebecca's question, of putting this regaining meritocracy and meritocracy towards serving the public interest, to bring it back as a priority. Because I think part of the change will have to come from that, because what we saw over the last year, it's not that people are demanding less state in Lebanon. On the contrary, they are demanding a more efficient, a less clientelist, a less corrupt state that has been captured by these same politicians. So as we think all together in the reform program that Ziad was talking about, which has to be first local, strongly based on local ownership, and as I mentioned, and as both my colleagues reiterated, is locally owned and is developed by the Lebanese. We will need to work with the international community on making sure that these core elements that make reform sustainable and not reversible, as we saw in the last 2 decades, a priority. And that comes by really focusing on institutional reforms and empowering those professionals who have served the state and the public interest, and finding a rule-based system that can privilege competence to serve the national interest as opposed to competence serving the corrupt elites.
Thank you very much, Alia, for that. And for all our speakers today, I'm going to bring this to an end now. This has been a very rich discussion about, a complex situation. I think there are obviously lots of challenges going forward, but I think we've heard today from our speakers some real serious ideas as to the sorts of reforms that are going to be necessary to allow Lebanon to go forward. The sorts of reforms which may not lead to a coup as such, but eating away, as I think Ziad was saying, at the current elites' hold on power. Anyhow, I wish you all very well. I hope you will join Caabu for future talks. We have one coming up, all the details on our website, and I think Joe will be putting it on the chat. We have a talk on Syria coming up. But my warm thanks to Alia, to Ziad Majed, Ziad Abdel Samad for talking to us today. I think in particular, from Beirut as well, with all the challenges that comes with that. Our solidarity is with you and all Lebanese who have suffered so much, and not just in recent months. It is awesome to see what Ziad Abdel Samad has said, the way in which civil societies came out to help people and to do what the state should have been doing. And I think that we should all recognize that and appreciate those sorts of efforts. Thank you, everybody. I wish you a very happy weekend, and we look forward to seeing you all at future Caabu events.
Thank you.